For 22 years, up until 1969, the U.S. Air Force carried on a project called Blue Book, which systematically listed, then presumably investigated, hundreds of reported sightings of unidentified flying objects. But Blue Book was discontinued because the Air Force said it found no real evidence that, one, UFOs existed at all, and two, if they did exist, that they posed any threat to national security. But Air Force involvement or not, presumably sober and rational people, each year by the hundreds, continue to tell us that they've seen something up there, and sometimes they even film or photograph what they've seen. 4 years ago, as an example, in Dayton, Ohio, newsman John Getter of station WKEF-TV made this film of what he thought was a UFO speeding away from a neighbor's backyard. He reported that it was white, that it made a sound like a low roaring, and that it sped away as he was getting his cameras ready. Well, ever since it became generally known that President Carter had once seen an unidentified object flying around the skies over Georgia, interest in this elusive topic has been revived. My first guest is none other than Academy Award-winning actor Cliff Robertson. He's just completed a 12-hour television special based on John Ehrlichman's book about Watergate, but Cliff is here to talk about something very, very different. He's been an eyewitness to a UFO. Cliff, welcome.
Thank you.
How you doing?
I'm fine.
Why don't you start by telling us about the incident?
Well, in your, you refer to sober and rational people. I know I'm sober, and I certainly was sober when I saw whatever it was I saw. I'm sorry I saw it because I had thought, like a lot of people, what would it be like to see something like that? I was always fascinated. But it's occurred to me that it would be really a delicate situation if you saw something that was so dramatic that, let's say, in the case of the young man that's going to be on the show later, you suddenly found yourself being looked at like you were weird or some kind of a kook. So I was always happy that I had never seen anything quite that dramatic. I simply saw something in the sky, and I'm a pilot and I've flown for many years. At the time, I remember saying, darn it, I wish I weren't seeing this, because for the rest of my life, if anyone asked me, I will be forced to tell the truth and say, well, yes, I did see something once, and I couldn't identify it. It was about 1965. I was in California, and I was out on the terrace, and I saw, a perfectly clear day, out over the Pacific Ocean, at what seemed to me as a pilot, an altitude, were it a plane, it would have looked as if it was possibly 50,000 feet in the air. It was obviously not a plane. It was of a metallic color. And it was moving across the sky at not a particularly fast rate. And I stopped and I looked at it and I immediately, of course, thought, well, it's obviously a weather balloon, which is very prevalent all over America. People many times see weather balloons, and because a balloon will sometimes temporarily stand still and then the wind will whip it away, it will look like a UFO darting off or something. So I looked at it, I thought, well, it's a weather balloon. And then it stopped, and I went back to my gardening, and then I looked up every 30 seconds or so, and it was still there. And then I got very curious, and I went in and I got my field glasses. So I watched this for about 10 minutes through the glasses, and then it did the thing that I've read since so many times. People say the same thing. It suddenly just darted, and it went up. It definitely went up from that already high height, and it was gone.
What in the world, or out of the world, do you think it was, Cliff?
I have no idea. It's unidentified because I checked subsequently. Well, I saw in the paper. A number of other people had seen the same thing that day. And Vandenberg had been asked, were they doing anything funny? And they said no, they had nothing in the air at all. So it was one of those, another one of those countless incidents that goes unexplained by, I hope, relatively rational people. I just say that I'm sorry that I saw the darn thing, because it's the first time I've ever been on television talking about it, and I know from now on there will always be a certain fringe group. There's always a reactionary group in every area. There's a reactionary group against people who say, hey, I saw something. And they say, well, I guess he had one too many.
We have been joined by Dr. J. Allen Hynek. He's a professor of astronomy at Northwestern University, and he is also the director of the Center for UFO Studies. He is also the publisher of the International UFO Reporter, and I should mention also that he served as a consultant to that Air Force Project Blue Book that I mentioned earlier for more than 20 years. Doctor, would you like to comment on what Cliff has just told us?
Yes, I found it very interesting, and he's one with a great many others. I think that in all my time with the Air Force, during which time I interrogated many hundreds of witnesses and read, of course, thousands of reports, that two statements predominate. One statement is, I never saw anything like this before in my life. And the second statement, almost as frequent, is, if I ever see anything like this again, I'm not going to say a word about it to anyone. So you're in good company.
Dr. Hynek, why don't you stay with us? We have some experts, including a man who says he spent 5 days in a spaceship as our next guest. And no, folks, he's not an astronaut. So stay with us. Cliff, thank you very much.
Thank you.
For most of his 20-odd years, Travis Walton has led a relatively ordinary life, but suddenly all that changed. Travis claims he was kidnapped, and not by your average kidnapper looking for some ransom money. Travis says creatures from outer space took him away on their spaceship for 5 days. Travis, welcome. It sounds, you must admit, absolutely unbelievable, almost ludicrous. Given that that terrible start off, why don't you tell me what happened?
There was 7 of us. We were working in the woods near Heber, Arizona, and we had quit for the day, and we were driving down this logging road, and it was just starting to get dark. It wasn't quite dark, it was about dusk, and one of the guys in the back says, "What's that?" You know, and there was a light coming through the trees off to the right, up ahead. And when we got around this thicket of trees where we could see what it was, there was this, this object hovering about 100 feet off the road. And we stopped the truck, and we sat there watching it. And I got out, and I walked up closer to it, to get a closer look.
What happened?
Well, I jumped down behind this log, and as I raised up to go, I just felt a numbing shock. And I blacked out. And my friends in the truck said they saw a beam come out of the craft and strike me in the head and the chest and knock me back through the air about 10 feet there. And they panicked and ran, They drove off.
Can I ask you, before you tell me the rest of the story, had you been taking any drugs on this day?
No, I just put in 8 hours of very hard labor.
Booze?
Nope, I was not hallucinating, I was not drunk, not crazy.
Okay, what happened?
When I finally became conscious, I looked around and I saw these 3 creatures standing over me.
What'd they look like?
They were a little under 5 feet tall. They had very large eyes, small nose, small mouth, small ears. They were very pale skinned. They had no hair, no eyelashes.
Were they human?
No, I wouldn't say they were human. It was very horrible. I jumped up, and there was this thing laying across me. It fell off, and I knocked them away from me. And I staggered over against the table there, and I lashed out at them with this thing that was laying there. But they started towards me, and then they stopped, and then they turned around and left all at once, and that was the last I saw of them.
Robert Schaefer is a member of the privately funded Committee to Scientifically Investigate Claims of the Paranormal. His specialty is UFOs. Bob, what do you think of Travis's story?
Well, unfortunately, there's very good evidence that what Travis is saying is not true, that in fact this is a deliberate hoax. Do you expect people to believe that your mother would tell the police, don't bother to look for him, he's not on this earth?
After a search of the area, and of course, she knew the men, and she naturally assumed that what had happened. It happened.
Travis has took a lie detector test after he supposedly reappeared, and he flunked it. And he flunked it very badly.
I was in too emotionally overwrought condition to take a test that soon after the incident. By the way, I did take one later, which was passed.
By a less experienced examiner while the boss was out of town.
Well,
And the
So
boss
there were
came
two
back.
tests. There were two polygraph tests. You failed the first, which was shortly after the alleged incident, and you passed the second. Is that what
But
happened?
more than that, if they covered up the fact that he failed the first one. The APRO, a UFO group, had paid for it along with the National Enquirer, and when Travis didn't pass, they kept the whole thing secret. There was like a cover-up, Watergate style. You know, they deep-sixed the embarrassing evidence, and then they stonewalled it in public.
Now, you and Dr. Hynek used to work together, true, Robert?
I was a student at Northwestern.
When
astronomy.
did you ever believe in UFOs?
I've been interested in UFOs for a long time. When I was a lot younger, I thought that there may well have been something to it, but
And now?
since then I've changed that opinion.
And your present opinion is?
I'm pretty skeptical about the whole thing. What always puzzles me is how is it that UFOs always somehow manage to slip away before the evidence becomes too convincing?
What about President Carter's sighting? May I ask you about that?
Right, I've investigated that one. I've made a number of phone calls down to Leary, Georgia, which is where it reportedly happened, and it just goes to show that even the most reliable and trustworthy person can be very mistaken in reporting something like a UFO because President Carter's supposed UFO lines up perfectly with the position of Venus in the sky.
Dr. Hynek, what do you think of Travis's story, briefly?
Well, I think that he underwent, I understand, a Minnesota multiphasic personality inventory and passed it with high colors. It showed that he was not psychotic or was not given to deception. Now, if that is so, I think that's a point in his favor. But what I've always felt about this case, I've divided it into two parts. One is the first part involving all seven, and they took lie detector tests and passed them. It fits a pattern. You see, if this were the only case on record, then I would have to say, well, I couldn't possibly believe it. But at the Center for UFO Studies now we have some 24 similar abduction cases now currently being studied. Something is going on.
My only commentary on this UFO segment is that I wish I could see one of them. Stay with us. We'll be right back after this.